For most of his life, Bob Hope presented himself as a quintessential all-American entertainer, witty, charming, and loyal to his wife, Dolores. But hidden deep in the folds of his personal history lies a chapter most fans never knew, a secret marriage, quietly swept under the rug, and a timeline that raises more than a few eyebrows. In 1933, well before he was a household name, Hope married a woman named Grace Louise Troxell. She wasn't a Hollywood starlet or someone seeking fame. She was a singer and radio personality from Chicago. Their wedding took place in Erie, Pennsylvania, far from the prying eyes of the entertainment press. According to official records, this was a legal marriage, not some romantic fling or misunderstood engagement. But just 1 year later, Bob would claim to have married Dolores Reed, the woman who would become publicly known as his lifelong partner. The problem? There's no record of a divorce from Troxell before that second union. That timeline raises serious questions. If the marriage to Troxell was never annulled or dissolved legally before Bob's marriage to Dolores, then technically, his second marriage may have been invalid, or at the very least, entered into under suspicious circumstances. It was a classic case of Hollywood narrative control. Behind the scenes, things were messy, but in public, the story was polished to perfection. For decades, press interviews and biographies told the same tale: Bob and Dolores, a true American love story. The Troxell marriage was buried, denied, or ignored entirely. In fact, even after official documents and marriage records surfaced proving the union with Troxell, Hope's camp worked hard to downplay it. They claimed the first marriage never legally counted, or that it was brief and irrelevant. But legal experts who examined the records suggested otherwise. Grace Troxell, for her part, eventually faded into obscurity, never publicly challenging the narrative or demanding acknowledgement. Perhaps she was paid to stay silent. Perhaps she chose to move on. But the truth was already out there. It just took decades for people to pay attention. This secret marriage, once thought to be a rumor, paint a very different picture of Bob Hope than the clean-cut persona he cultivated. It suggests not just a hidden past, but a willingness to manipulate timelines, silence inconvenient facts, and reshape public perception to maintain his image. And while many celebrities have skeletons in their closets, Hope's ability to keep this buried for so long speaks volumes about how power operated in classic Hollywood. The story of Bob and Dolores remains iconic, but the overlooked presence of Grace Troxell throws that fairy tale into question. And if one marriage could be erased so cleanly, what else might have been hidden behind Hope's charming grin? Next, we'll dive into the string of women that followed, and how Hope's romantic life was far more complicated than anyone suspected. While Bob Hope built a career making millions laugh, his personal life played out like a secret drama behind the scenes, a drama that involved a revolving door of women, whisper affairs, and relationships that challenged his carefully curated public image. To the world, he was a lovable jokester, always loyal to his wife, Dolores. But those who moved in Hollywood's inner circles knew a different story entirely. One of a man who charmed, pursued, and often concealed countless liaisons. Bob Hope had a type, young, ambitious, and usually blonde. He was known for surrounding himself with beauty queens, showgirls, and actresses hoping for their big break. The list of women he was romantically linked to is long and, in many cases, unconfirmed. But some names come up again and again, women like Barbara Payton, Marilyn Maxwell, and Rosemarie Frankland. Barbara Payton, a sultry film noir actress with a troubled reputation, had a brief but highly publicized connection with Hope. Though never confirmed officially, the rumor mill buzzed. Payton eventually spiraled into scandal herself, but she wasn't afraid to sell her story to tabloids like Confidential magazine, alluding to powerful men and dangerous affairs. Hope's name appeared between the lines more than once, though he never addressed it publicly. His silence spoke volumes. Then there was Marilyn Maxwell, a bold, glamorous actress and singer who became a known fixture in Bob's life for years. Their relationship wasn't exactly subtle. In fact, insiders at Paramount and various USO tours referred to her casually as Mrs. Bob Hope. She performed with him regularly, traveled with him, and was photographed by his side, so often that questions inevitably followed. Yet Dolores, Bob's wife, rarely commented, and the media, perhaps out of respect, fear, or careful management, never pushed too hard. But perhaps the most lasting and controversial of all was his decades-long affair with Rosemarie Frankland, a former Miss World from Wales. Bob allegedly met her during the Miss World pageant he helped judge in the early 1960s. She was barely out of her teens. He was in his late 50s. Their connection turned into a secret romance that many say lasted until her death in 2000. Some insiders claim he even supported her financially for years, giving her homes, cars, and a quiet life away from the spotlight. Despite the countless whispers and rumors, Hope managed to keep his affairs largely out of mainstream headlines. Part of this was due to the tight control he maintained over his public image. He employed a dedicated team of publicists, often paying off reporters or using influence to suppress damaging stories. In return, the press got access, interviews, and exclusive appearances, a trade that kept his secrets buried for decades. These were not just flings or accidents. They were patterns, stretching across decades and careers, carefully hidden behind jokes and one-liners. Hope mastered the art of double living. To fans, he was America's sweetheart. To Hollywood insiders, he was a seasoned operator who rarely took no for an answer. But when whispers started leaking into the tabloids, not even Hope's charm could contain the truth forever. By the 1950s, Bob Hope was one of the most recognizable faces in the world. He was adored by audiences, beloved by the military, and constantly in the spotlight. But even the brightest stars cast shadows, and some of those shadows started creeping into the pages of America's most scandal-hungry publications. Despite his best efforts to maintain an image of squeaky clean patriotism, the tabloids were beginning to piece together a very different picture, one filled with side affairs, payoffs, and secrets too juicy to stay hidden forever. The most brazen example came from actress Barbara Payton, whose life played out like a cautionary tale of Hollywood's dark side. Known for her turbulent relationships and explosive personality, Payton was never one to hold back, especially when it came to the powerful men she claimed had used and discarded her. Among those names was Bob Hope. In a move that stunned insiders, Payton sold her story to Confidential, one of the most notorious gossip magazines of its time. While she stopped short of naming every name directly, the implication was loud and clear. Bob Hope wasn't the innocent entertainer he pretended to be. Hope, famously, never responded publicly to the story. He didn't sue, didn't deny, didn't engage. Instead, he let silence do the work. That silence, however, wasn't a result of shame. It was strategic. According to several biographers and Hollywood insiders, Hope had a full-time team whose job was to scrub his public image clean. They worked closely with studio fixers and press agents, keeping damaging stories out of circulation in exchange for access or favors. In many cases, reporters were offered exclusive interviews or early access to his projects, so long as they played nice. But sometimes, the whispers got too loud to ignore. Take Marilyn Maxwell, for instance. Their relationship was so open that many in the industry just assumed they were an item. While Hope remained married to Dolores, Maxwell was consistently seen with him at studio parties, rehearsals, and even during USO tours overseas. Colleagues began jokingly calling her Mrs. Hope, and the nickname stuck. While the public was largely kept in the dark, Hollywood insiders knew what was going on. But again, the media never called him out, not directly. Hope's team worked hard to keep the tabloids at bay, and when threats emerged, they were quickly neutralized through either cash settlements or professional favors. Even more shocking were reports that Hope had gone so far as to use intimidation or influence to silence women he had been involved with. While no formal accusations were ever filed, multiple biographies reference quiet payments and confidential arrangements made with women who had threatened to go public. These stories never made the front page, but they circulated in back rooms and cocktail parties throughout Beverly Hills. For years, the tabloids had to dance around the truth. Hope was too big, too powerful, too well-connected to be taken down by gossip, but the stories kept coming, some in hushed tones, some in bold headlines, and all pointing to a man whose private world was far messier than his clean-cut jokes let on. And eventually, the one person who had stayed silent the longest, his own daughter, stepped forward and confirmed what many had long suspected. For decades, Bob Hope's image remained untouched, carefully manicured through charm, connections, and a relentless team of handlers. But even the tightest secrets eventually crack. And in Bob Hope's case, the confirmation didn't come from an enemy, a journalist, or a spurned lover. It came from someone much closer to home, his adopted daughter, Linda Hope. Linda had spent her life in the shadow of Bob's fame. While he was on the road, entertaining troops or filming another special, she stayed largely out of the public eye. She was a quiet one, the loyal daughter, always there with a polite smile beside Dolores at events. For years, she maintained a family image, until she didn't. In the early 2000s, long after Bob's death in 2003, Linda began speaking more candidly about her father. She never launched a public takedown or tell-all expose, but her interviews were striking in their honesty. In one moment, she'd praise his work ethic and generosity. In the next, she'd admit what many had long suspected, that her father had been complicated, especially when it came to women. She hinted at relationships outside the marriage, saying flatly that Dolores had made peace with the life she had. That single statement spoke volumes. While Linda stopped short of naming names, her tone was matter-of-fact, not apologetic. She acknowledged the dual lives her father led, one for the cameras and one behind closed doors. She described Dolores as a strong woman who understood exactly what she was signing up for and chose to stay. It was less a marriage of blind romance and more an arrangement, one rooted in public image, shared legacy, and quiet resilience. Dolores, it seemed, preferred to look the other way. And Linda, she chose honesty. But the most surprising admission came in a less publicized interview, where Linda addressed persistent rumors about Hope's decades-long relationship with Rosemarie Frankland. According to Linda, Rosemarie was more than just a fling. She was a presence in Bob's life for years. He cared for her deeply, she said. That subtle confirmation sent shockwaves through the fan base. Frankland, a former Miss World, had died under tragic circumstances in 2000, and there had long been whispers that Bob had financially supported her until the end. Linda's words gave those whispers weight. What made Linda's perspective so compelling wasn't just what she revealed. It was how calmly and casually she said it. There was no bitterness, no scandal chasing. Just a daughter acknowledging the complexities of a man the world thought it knew. In doing so, she didn't destroy his legacy, but she did add a layer of realism that made it impossible to view him in the same light again. The revelation that Dolores had tolerated these relationships and that Linda had long been aware of them shifted the narrative. This wasn't about one or two indiscretions. It was a lifestyle, a carefully guarded double life that even his family had quietly accepted. But as the veil began to lift, another story started to gain traction, one involving the secret home, the hidden woman, and the emotional fallout that lasted decades. While Hollywood rumors about Bob Hope's flings were constant background noise, there was one relationship that stood apart from the others. One woman who didn't just pass through his life for a few months or years. She was there for decades, tucked away from the limelight, kept out of headlines, and rarely acknowledged, even in whispers. Her name was Rosemarie Frankland. To the world, she was Miss World 1961. To Bob Hope, she was far more than that. Hope first met Rosemarie in London during the Miss World competition, which he happened to be judging. She was 18. He was 58. By most accounts, their relationship began almost immediately after the pageant. And from that moment on, she remained a quiet constant in his life. Not in public, not on red carpets, but behind the scenes. For years, she traveled with him, stayed at properties he owned, and was regularly spotted by staff and insiders, always just out of the spotlight. What made this relationship particularly unsettling to some was the age gap. and the power dynamics involved. Rosemarie was young, impressionable, and entering a world where Hope held all the cards. He was a gatekeeper to opportunity, fame, and protection. She, like many young women before and after her, may have believed she was stepping into a fairy tale. But fairy tales don't usually end with decades spent in quiet isolation. Biographers suggest that Bob Hope bought her a house in Los Angeles and paid for her expenses well into the 1990s. In fact, some speculate he was still secretly supporting her even after his public appearances had slowed and his health declined. She never spoke about their relationship in public, never gave an interview, never sold a story. That silence, some argue, was a clearer sign of how deep their connection went, and how much pressure may have been applied to keep it hidden. But not everything stayed quiet forever. In 2000, just 3 years before Hope passed away, Rosemarie died from what was widely reported as a substance-related incident. It was a lonely, tragic end. No public funeral, no official statements from the Hope family, just a brief obituary and more silence. Some claim she had struggled with depression for years, exacerbated by the secrecy and loneliness of her life in Hope's shadow. Friends of Rosemarie later revealed that she confided in them about her heartbreak and confusion, how she felt simultaneously adored and discarded, loved deeply but never claimed. It was the emotional toll of being someone's secret for a lifetime. And what's most haunting, despite everything, Bob reportedly cared for her until the end. But he never acknowledged her publicly. Not once, even after her death. This wasn't a fling. It wasn't a rumor. It was a full chapter of Bob Hope's life, written in the margins, hidden in shadows, and only now starting to be understood for what it truly was. But the cracks in the story didn't stop with Rosemarie. Behind the smiles and one-liners, Bob's entire image, his patriotism, his morality, even his legacy, was built on carefully managed illusions, and those illusions were finally starting to crumble. For most of the 20th century, Bob Hope was seen as the embodiment of American charm, a quick-witted, flag-waving entertainer who supported the troops, raised millions to charity, and made America laugh through wars, recessions, and cultural revolutions. But as time marched on, that polished image began to show its wear. Beneath the tuxedo and trademark smirk, people started to ask, who was Bob Hope really? By the time the 1990s rolled around, Bob Hope had slowed down. The aging entertainer was no longer the dominant media force he once was, and as his grip on Hollywood faded, so did the protection that had shielded him for decades. Without the same level of control over the press, questions started creeping into the conversation. The carefully guarded facade he'd built, one joke at a time, wasn't just cracking. It was quietly collapsing. Journalists and biographers began digging into the stories that had long been buried. The affairs, the payoffs, the secret relationships that spanned decades. Books like Hope, Entertainer of the Century by Richard Zoglin, went deeper than any authorized biography ever had. Zoglin, after extensive interviews and research, confirmed much of what had only been whispered before, especially Hope's double life and the women quietly orbiting around him. These weren't just rumors anymore. They were documented, and they painted a much more complicated portrait of the man who had once been America's favorite uncle. The most striking part of the revelations wasn't that Hope had been unfaithful. Hollywood was built on that. It was how methodical and orchestrated his private life had been. Hope had created a system, an inner circle that kept secrets, a network of publicists and handlers who knew what to suppress and when to distract the public. It was a kind of personal PR machine, decades ahead of its time. And then there was Dolores Hope, his wife of nearly 70 years. She had been with him since the very beginning, a devout Catholic and a woman of quiet dignity. Many believed Dolores had made peace with her husband's indiscretions early on, focusing instead on charity work and her own pursuits. But some close to the family hinted that Dolores' silence wasn't acceptance, it was exhaustion. She knew confronting Bob meant confronting the entire machine built around him. As the truth became harder to deny, fans began grappling with the complexity of Hope's legacy. Could someone bring joy to millions while living a life of manipulation behind closed doors? Could patriotism and moral comedy coexist with deception and secrecy? These weren't easy questions, but they became impossible to ignore. Bob Hope's legacy didn't vanish. He's still remembered as a comedy legend, a USO hero, a pioneer of television and radio. But the story is no longer black and white. The truth, as it turns out, is far more layered and far more human. And perhaps the most human part of all was what happened near the end of his life, when the spotlight dimmed and some of his deepest regrets quietly came to the surface. As the 20th century drew to a close, so did Bob Hope's reign as America's tireless entertainer. The man who once seemed immortal began to slow down, his sharp timing dulled, his presence more ghost-like than grand. By the time he turned 90, Hope had largely retreated from public life, surrounded by family, wealth, and memories that few could rival. But those close to him say something changed in those final years. The charm never left, but the mask started to slip. Hope, who had once juggled audiences, co-stars, and mistresses with seemingly effortless control, became quieter, reflective. He was still cracking jokes, but now they were softer, more personal. For the first time in his life, Bob Hope had to sit still. And for a man who'd spent decades running from scrutiny and emotion, stillness was unfamiliar ground. Privately, he grew more contemplative, especially about the choices that had defined him. Some close friends noted that Bob, in quiet moments, would talk about Rosemarie Frankland, not as a scandal, but as someone he truly missed. Her death in 2000 hit him hard, more than anyone expected. He reportedly kept a photo of her in his study, one that no one ever saw while he was alive. To the outside world, she had been erased. But to Bob, she was never truly gone. It wasn't just Rosemarie, though. There were whispers that Bob regretted how things had unfolded with his children, especially Linda. Though she remained loyal, there were obvious strains in their relationship. She had spent years watching her father maintain an emotional distance that wasn't just reserved for outsiders. It sometimes applied to family, too. In interviews after his death, Linda spoke of him lovingly, but often described a man driven more by obligation than intimacy. And then there was Dolores. She had stood by him longer than most marriages last, raising their adopted children, managing the household, even participating in his USO tours. But their marriage had long functioned more as a business partnership than a romantic union. Toward the end, Bob reportedly tried to bridge the emotional distance between them. He spent more time at home, made more of an effort to show appreciation. Some in the family say that Dolores had already made peace with his past, and that in those final years, they found a kind of quiet understanding. Not forgiveness necessarily, but acceptance. As his health declined, the jokes became less frequent. Bob, once the king of quips, grew more serious. And according to one longtime friend, the biggest shift wasn't his voice or memory. It was in his eyes. There was sadness there, he said, not for fame or the work, but for the stuff he couldn't fix. Hope passed away in 2003, just 2 months after turning 100. A century of laughter, history, and contradictions. And in the end, perhaps what lingered most weren't the applause or the headlines, but the silences, the things he never said, and the people he never fully claimed. But when the curtain finally fell, the truth didn't die with him. It only got louder, and what came next would change how the world remembered Bob Hope forever. After Bob Hope's death in 2003, tributes poured in from around the world. Presidents praised him. Veterans remembered him. Hollywood stars called him a legend, a trailblazer, a national treasure. The narrative was neat, clean, and familiar. Bob Hope, the man who made America laugh for nearly a century. But behind those glowing headlines, another version of the story was quietly emerging. One that didn't erase his legacy, but redefined it. In the years following his passing, new books, documentaries, and exposés began digging beneath the surface. Authors no longer tiptoed around the sensitive stuff. Biographers began speaking openly about the affairs, the secrecy, and emotional distance that defined his personal life. People close to Bob, assistants, former lovers, even family, started talking. And what they revealed wasn't a hit piece. It was a reckoning. What made it all so compelling was how carefully Bob had controlled his image while he was alive. He wasn't just a celebrity, he was a brand, a symbol of decency, humor, and patriotism. He played golf with presidents, made surprise appearances for troops, and headlined more benefit shows than anyone could count. But behind that carefully polished exterior was a man who struggled with loyalty, intimacy, and the very morality he often joked about. For decades, the entertainment industry helped maintain that illusion. Gossip columnists were fed harmless stories about golf outings and celebrity roasts, while the real drama stayed behind locked doors. But in the posthumous spotlight, the truth had more room to breathe, and fans began seeing a different Bob Hope. Not the caricature of perfection, but a flawed man who, in many ways, mirrored the contradictions of the country he entertained. Even his charitable work, once considered untouchable, came under closer scrutiny. Yes, Bob gave millions and entertained soldiers across countless war zones. But critics pointed out that he also benefited greatly from the image of selfless patriotism. The brand of Bob Hope became as much a business as a persona. Some question whether his tireless USO work was entirely altruistic or also a way to secure his legacy in the hearts of Americans, far from the scandals at home. And yet here's the twist. The truth didn't destroy him. In fact, for many fans and historians, the messiness of his life made him more real. The cracks in the armor didn't shatter his legacy. They added texture to it. Bob Hope wasn't just a smiling entertainer. He was a complicated man who made millions laugh while quietly juggling a life full of secrets. And in some ways, that's what makes his story so unforgettable. Because now, when people look back on Bob Hope, they don't just see the jokes and the specials. They see the man behind the curtain, the contradictions, the compromises, and the carefully guarded truths that only came out once the lights were off and the stage was empty. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most human legacy of all. Thanks for watching. If this story surprised you or made you see Bob Hope in a whole new light, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories behind the legends. There's always more than meets the eye.